So my novel, Small Acts of Defiance, tells the story of a young woman whose mother is French and whose father is Australian. And after a family tragedy, she needs to leave Australia with her French mother and return to France. This happens, though, at the start of 1940. So war has obviously been declared, and they arrive not long before the Germans invade France and then find themselves trapped in Nazi-occupied Paris over the next 4 years. And it's called Small Acts of Defiance because it really is the story of an ordinary young woman, not a resistance hero, not a spy. It's just an ordinary young woman who finds herself in extraordinary circumstances and has to decide how she's going to respond to what she sees happening around her. She learns a whole lot. She arrives as a bit of a naive young woman, very politically naive, very quickly becomes friends with a young Jewish student who is very politically engaged, and through her relationship with this friend, decides how she's going to respond, and little by little becomes engaged in these small acts of defiance against the occupying forces. Yeah, so I did a lot of research for this novel, obviously, but I think the foundation for it was the fact that I lived in France for 12 years. So as a young woman, I arrived there at the age of about 21 and left at the age of 33. So in those very formative years, I was really, my political awareness and my awareness of French culture and history was really formed over those very formative years. And I really became passionate about French language and culture and history. And so I did a lot of the unconscious research, I guess, for the novel in those years. And something that triggered the idea for the novel was, in fact, my husband at the time was working for a property manager in Paris. So there are a lot of owners who own large portfolios of property. And this firm had been around since before the Second World War. And one day he was down in the archives of this firm and came across a lease document from about 1943. And it showed that an apartment which had previously belonged to a Jewish family, the family had been deported, and then the apartment had been reallocated to a non-Jewish French family. And so he realized that the firm that he was working for had actively collaborated with the French collaborationist authorities and the Germans in this deportation of the Jews and reallocating their apartments, which had been emptied of all their possessions. Yet this was something that was never acknowledged by the firm. And I realized over the 12 years that I was living in France that this was a very, very common occurrence. It was a very, very awkward, delicate situation to bring up what people had done during the war, what their parents had done. And I started living there in 86. So that was 40 years after the war, which can seem like a long time. But when you think about it, that's as close to the war as the 80s are to us now. It's in recent living memory. So there were a lot of people who had lived through the war, and certainly their parents had. But it was very, very awkward to talk about what had happened, because obviously the French regime, Vichy, had not only surrendered to the Germans, they had actively collaborated in the deportation of Jews. And this was something that took a long time to really be acknowledged by the French. It was only in, I think, 2005 that the then President Chirac apologized on behalf of the French state for their part in the collaboration. So it was something that really permeated French society, yet was always under the surface and was very difficult to acknowledge. So I did a little bit of research then. Then in 2017, I was awarded an Australia Council for the Arts residency in Paris. And so I spent 6 months there doing intensive research. And I was lucky enough, my studio in the International City of the Arts was next door. In fact, it shared a wall with the Holocaust Memorial. And so I was able to visit it dozens of times. And they have an incredible collection of artifacts from the Second World War, and also like eyewitness accounts. And one thing that happened every Saturday morning there, which really struck me and which I learned a lot from, was they would have a commemoration for convoy that had left on that date. So, for example, on the 17th of September 2017, they would have a commemoration for the convoy that left for Auschwitz on the 17th of September, say 1943. And the survivors, or more often the descendants of the people who had been deported, would come and speak and just deliver bear witness to what they had experienced on that day. And I remember one particular man, he would have been in his mid-80s at that stage, and he had been a young boy, about 7 or 8, back in the 40s. And he told the story of that morning of the roundup. There were numerous roundups that happened in Paris, often facilitated by the French authorities. So he had been rounded up as a little boy with his mother and siblings. His father had already been deported. And he remembers that morning, and he said that his mother realized what was happening. And as the French policemen turned their backs, she realized that she had a couple of minutes to get him to run away and hide and go and see neighbors and try and escape. And she told him to run away, and he didn't want to. He was a little 7-year-old boy. So he clung to her and said, no, no. And she realized that what she had to do was she slapped him and yelled at him, get out of here, get out of here. And he started crying and ran away. And that was what saved him. And he was this man in his 80s telling this story, and all I could hear was this 7-year-old boy's voice. He was crying, and that was the last image he had of his mother, and it had haunted him for all these 70 years. And so things like that. I mean, there's the research. Yes, there's incredible literature. There's the incredible archives, but those eyewitness accounts are something that I'll never forget, and which I hope informed the sentiment that I wanted to put into this novel. So yeah, look, as I said, it's a period of history that's all obviously very, very rich, but really under-acknowledged. And I think, especially for Australian audiences, we know the main lines of what happened during the Second World War. We know about the collaboration, we know about the D-Day landings and things like that. But I think when we focus on the role of the French population during the Second World War, I think there tends to be a lot of focus on the heroic resistance fighters. And look, and rightly so, there were some extremely brave people who carried out some extraordinary acts. And certainly, the Allied invasion of France and the retaking of France would have been much more difficult without what the resistance did. But there's a little bit of knowledge about the collaboration, but there's also this large part of the population which were kind of neither extreme resistant members or extreme collaborators. And I think I really wanted to shine a light on that part of the population that were living in difficult circumstances. It's not easy to live in an occupied country. And yet life went on. The French have an attitude of just, getting on with life. And that can be a good thing because it helped them to survive. But there was also a lot of compromise that went on. There was also a lot of really active collaboration. We have a vision of France as the country of, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and, it's the home of human rights in the French Revolution. But there's also a very dark history of anti-Semitism in France, which is not as widely acknowledged. And especially in the lead up to the war, there had been a Jewish prime minister elected, and there was huge backlash against that. He survived an assassination attempt. So the right wing, the extreme right wing, the anti-Semites had really come to the surface in the lead up to the war. And so they really felt emboldened and actually, quite passionately in support of the German project. And when you look at Pétain and Vichy, the things that they did, for example, they had already put together databases of where Jewish people lived in Paris, and they handed that over to the Germans before the Germans even requested it. So there was enthusiastic collaboration from a small part of the French population. So that was really what I wanted to examine, this unacknowledged history of anti-Semitism, which is in such contrast to the vision that a lot of people, a lot of outsiders have of France and the French population, given the focus that we've had on the resistance movements. Yeah, so Lucie is an outsider, but she does have a connection to France. Her mother is French. And she arrives in France as a young woman, 17. So really at that stage where you're starting to form your identity, decide who you are going to be as an adult, what you believe in, what you stand for. And I think that maybe it wasn't conscious, but I think that did really reflect the experience that I had had arriving in France at the age of 21. Pretty naive, pretty politically unaware. I'd studied French in high school. I knew a little bit about French history and culture. But back in the 80s, you know, a young woman, I wasn't really all that aware of the complexities of French history and French politics and French culture. And so I arrived there. I had a French boyfriend who was very politically engaged, so a little bit like Aline, Lucie's sidekick, her friend in my novel. And he was, you know, really helped me open my eyes to French history and politics and culture. And over a long period, over those 12 years, I became very aware of what was going on in France. I became very involved in demonstrations, the French Lover demonstration. So I was very engaged in that. I was a student at the Sorbonne. The start of the school year was in October, and by the end of October, we would all be on strike and out demonstrating. And so that is something that is has been for centuries, has been part of the French culture. Students are very politically engaged, and I certainly was when I was a student at Sorbonne. But it took me time, you know, to build up that awareness of what was happening, of all the complexities of the French political system. And also the historical influences on what was going on. The Communist Party was still very active in France in the 80s, very popular. That was something that was completely new to an Australian, you know, where the Communist Party had completely disappeared here by that stage. So it took me a while to really understand what was happening, but once I did understand, I was very keen to be part of that. So yeah, there are lots of parallels, I think. It wasn't conscious when I was writing the novel, but I think there are quite a few parallels between my experience of having my eyes open to France and Europe, I suppose, as well. You know, it was a fascinating time in Europe. I was there when the Berlin Wall came down. My husband and I jumped on an overnight train to Berlin, got there a couple of days after the wall came down. So it was a very interesting time in European history, just as it was for Lucie, my protagonist. Look, I think the question of personal responsibility is at the heart of the novel. Lucie takes a little while to understand whether she should engage in any acts of defiance at all. She sees what's going on around her. The students are very engaged, risking their lives. But she understands what's at stake here. It really was a life and death situation, making that decision to be engaged in any way. And what she tries at first is to engage in symbolic actions and things like, you know, drawing V's on walls and illustrating and writing tracts that are distributed. And certainly that was something that was very important at the time. But as the situation evolves and she sees the persecution of the people around her, especially the Jewish population of Paris, and the people that she's involved with become engaged in more and more direct and violent means of resistance, she kind of has to ask herself, what is the weight of symbolic resistance when you're faced with violence at that scale? And I think at one stage her friend Aline, you know, says to her, look, the pen is not mightier than the sword when the sword is a Panzer tank or a machine gun. You know, you have to make that decision. And I think that's what I was thinking about while I was writing the book. And it's very easy in hindsight to say, look, with what we know now about what was going on, symbolic resistance and demonstrations and flyers and drawings, we're really just playing their game by refusing to engage in violent resistance. And that's what's at the heart of the novel, I guess. Is it ever justifiable to compromise your principles of non-violent resistance, regardless of what's happening around you? Or do you have to stoop to the same level as your enemy and engage them with their own tactics? And that's something I think I was conscious of while I was writing it, because I was in France doing the research in 2017. Trump had just been elected. We were seeing neo-Nazis with flaming torches marching through the streets, people proudly declaring themselves white supremacists. So the echoes were eerily strong of what had happened, and just that sentiment that we had learned nothing. We were back in the 1930s. We were seeing this slow rise again of what we had seen. And so that question of, well, the relevance and also our responsibility, how do we react? Do we just trust that we will not repeat the errors of history, that this slow rise will not lead where it led 80 years ago? Or can we have confidence in that? I don't think we can. And so I think that question that Lucie and Aline, my characters, were asking themselves about what is the right way to respond, to what degree do we engage in violence in order to respond, to what degree do we just use symbolic acts? I think that's really relevant to us even now. I mean, is it enough to sign a petition online? Is it enough to like a social media post online? Or do we need to get out and demonstrate? Or is even demonstrating enough? Is it enough to wait for the next election and hope that enough people will, feel like us and there'll be a shift in the political mood? I don't think these questions have changed at all. And look, we've had a change in the US presidency since, so that's reassuring, but there are still 70 million people who voted for Trump. And I think we should be alarmed. And one of the women who really inspired writing this novel is a woman called Simone Weil, not the philosopher, French politician. She was Jewish, a survivor of Auschwitz, who became a leading light in French politics. She was president of the European Parliament. She died in 2017. She was venerated. Her ashes have been transferred to the Panthéon in Paris. Just a few weeks ago, her memorial was vandalized, defaced with swastikas. I think we should be alarmed that this type of thing is still going on in 2021. And so I think we all have to ask ourselves those questions. How do we respond? And what is enough? Are symbolic acts enough? Do we need to be, really be engaged and active, or can we just, is it enough just to have those conversations and like Facebook posts and things like that? And there's no easy answer. And it's easy for us to look back at what people did during the war in hindsight and judge what they should have done or shouldn't have done. And people will be doing that in 50 years' time, looking at how we're responding to this rise of neo-Nazism and white supremacism again. And there are no answers, but hopefully at least people will see the parallels and think about their responsibility. Yeah, so the notions of family and loyalty were really explored in the novel on a personal level, but also on a large level, because Gérard, who's the uncle, has lost his family, his wife and his daughter after the First World War. And so the only family he has left are Yvonne, his sister, and Lucie, his niece. And even though he's very protective, he has this very conservative and patriarchal attitude towards protecting them, he uses that to justify some of the acts that he's engaged in. And I don't want to give too much away, but he is very anti-Semitic, engages in some horrific acts, but is also very, very anti-German. And I think he's really torn between that sentiment of loyalty to his family and the acts that he wants to engage in. And that really reflects something that was going on in France more broadly. So Pétain, who was the leader of the French state, was at the time in his 80s. And he'd been named leader of the French state because he was an old soldier. He was a veteran of the First World War, had been a leader in the First World War, and was the hero of Verdun, which was one of the big battles of the First World War. And he was venerated in France. He was considered like the grandfather, the father of France. And so even though he had surrendered and signed these articles of collaboration with the Germans, there was a large part of the French population which still was extremely loyal to him as a father figure, a grandfather figure, and put absolute trust and faith in him to protect his family. He really did have that role as the father figure. And so even though he was collaborating with the Germans, there was this dissonance in people's heads. They saw that that was a necessary measure that he had taken to protect the family, that anything was, they had absolute trust in him to not do wrong by them. And what they were also doing was realizing that he was willing to sacrifice a part of the French population who he considered not really French, the Jewish population, in order to protect the core family, the real French family. And the French have a very strange notion, or they've had a dispute for decades over who is really French. And when you look at the National Front in France, they always want to exclude people who were just born in France and say, no, that's not sufficient to be considered French. You have to have French blood, whatever that is. And so they had this argument between, French blood and French birth. And that was something, I guess, that was at the heart of this loyalty to the nation state, to the family, that they were turning inwards, whether it was looking just at your family, your religion, your nation state. There was this turning inwards and excluding, therefore, of a whole lot of other people. And there were a whole lot of Jewish people from the East, from the Eastern Bloc, Eastern countries, that had sought asylum in France in the decades leading up to the war and the years leading up to the war, because rightly so, they had considered France this country of this safe haven, a country of asylum. It had a reputation over centuries of providing asylum to people fleeing persecution. And so they thought of all places they would be safe in France. And yet with this turning inwards and the redefining of who you should be loyal to, whether it be your immediate family, people in your religion, or the people who had centuries of history in your nation state. That's what was happening. And I think that's the message that, if anything comes out of this, is that can be very, very dangerous. Yes, it's a natural tendency to want to protect your immediate family or to have bonds with the people who have things in common with you. But we know that patriotism leads very, very quickly to nationalism, and a turning inwards to the people who immediately surround you leads to exclusion and othering of people who have any differences from you. So I guess that's hopefully the message that people will find relevant and will reflect on.